Sit down. I want to tell you something about the loaf of sourdough you paid $8 for. There is no law in this country that says it had to be sourdough. The Food and Drug Administration has been writing binding legal definitions for food since 1939. They're called standards of identity, and a standard of identity spells out what a food must contain and how it has to be made before you're allowed to put that name on it. The agency has written more than 250 of them. They started because companies were selling jam that had almost no fruit in it. There's a standard of identity for ketchup. There's one for white bread. There's one for milk bread and one for egg bread, which are products I have never in my life watched a human being put in a cart. There is no standard of identity for sourdough, not in the United States, and as of this year, not in any major market on earth. The word on that bag is doing no work at all. It's a marketing term with $4 extra stapled to it. Now, I've had the same starter alive on my counter for 19 years, and I'll tell you the first thing about it that surprised me, because it's the thing nobody says out loud. Sourdough is misnamed. It is not really a yeast bread. In a mature starter, the bacteria outnumber the yeast cells by roughly 100 to 1. The yeast makes it rise. The bacteria make it bread. Start with what's in the jar, because everything else follows from the population living in it. A sourdough starter is flour and water and two kinds of organism. There are wild yeasts, which eat sugars and give off carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide is what lifts the loaf. And there are lactic acid bacteria, which are the same broad family of organisms that turn milk into yogurt and cabbage into sauerkraut. People shorten that to LAB. The bacteria are the majority shareholders. Across 19 traditional Italian sourdoughs that got sequenced in one study, the ratio of bacteria to yeast ran from about 100 to 1 down to 10 to 1. One of them, the starter behind Pane di Matera, ran near 1,000 to 1. The bacterium that shows up most often in wheat sourdough has a name worth knowing, because it's named after a city you'd guess. It's called Fructolactobacillus sanfranciscensis. It was described from San Francisco sourdough, and it carried the name Lactobacillus sanfranciscensis until a taxonomy revision moved it. In that Italian survey, it was about 28% of every bacterium they isolated. Here is the part that made me actually put down what I was reading. That bacterium is heterofermentative, which means it doesn't just make one product out of sugar. It makes lactic acid, which tastes mild and round and yogurty. And it also makes acetic acid, which is the sharp vinegar note, plus carbon dioxide. So the bacteria are contributing lift too, and both of the flavors you're tasting come from the same organism, running the same metabolism in different proportions. And the classic sourdough yeast that pairs with it cannot digest maltose. Maltose is the sugar that comes off broken down starch, and it's the sugar that bacterium runs on. Sit with that. The culture is stable for 100 years on a countertop because of what each organism can't do. They aren't cooperating. They just aren't competing for the same meal. That's the whole engine. Now the vocabulary you need to talk about the dough itself. Bakers describe every ingredient as a percentage of the flour weight, and flour is always 100. That's called baker's percentage. So, a loaf with 500 grams of flour and 375 grams of water is at 75% hydration. Hydration is just that number, the water as a percentage of the flour. It sounds like bookkeeping, and it isn't. It's the only way to compare two recipes honestly, and it's how you scale a loaf up or down without doing arithmetic you'll get wrong at 6 in the morning. Every real decision in this bread is a decision about that population, what you feed it, and how warm you keep it. That's the whole craft. The shaping is theater. You do not buy a starter, and you do not need somebody's 100-year-old heirloom mailed to you in a padded envelope. 50 grams of flour, 50 grams of water, a clean jar. That's it. Whole wheat or rye for the first few days, because the bran carries more of the organisms you're recruiting and more of the minerals they eat. Lid resting on top, not screwed down because the thing produces gas. For the first 2 days, leave it alone. Around day 2 or 3, you'll see bubbles, and it will smell wrong. Sharp, a little like cheese or acetone. That is not failure. That's the early scramble, when the organisms that lose are still in there. The population sorts itself out over the following week, and the smell turns from sharp to sour to something closer to bread. From day 3, you feed it. Discard most of it, keep a spoonful, add fresh flour and water. Once a day at room temperature. It takes 7 to 14 days to become reliable, not 2. The internet will tell you 5, and then you'll blame yourself when a loaf comes out flat, and the actual problem was that you had a young culture that hadn't finished sorting itself out. What you're doing in those 2 weeks is selection. You're not adding organisms, they're already on the flour and in the room. You're setting conditions, warm, wet, acidic, regularly fed, that favor the ones you want and starve the ones you don't. The acid is the security system. As it drops the pH, the culture becomes a place where most spoilage organisms can't establish. That's why a jar of flour paste on your counter doesn't rot, which brings up the thing people ask me most, which is how often the thing has to be fed and what happens when you forget. The feeding ratio is written as starter to flour to water by weight.
1 to 1 to 1 means 20 grams of old starter, 20 grams of flour, 20 grams of water. That's a small meal and it peaks fast, maybe 4 hours in a warm kitchen. 1 to 5 means 20 grams of starter fed 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. That's a big meal. It takes 8 or 10 hours to peak, and it produces a milder, less acidic culture because the population spends longer growing before it runs out. So the ratio is not a maintenance detail, it's a flavor control. Smaller feeds and longer weights build acid. Bigger feeds and shorter weights keep it mild. Reading the jar matters more than the clock. A starter rises, domes, and then flattens and falls, and you want it at or just past the dome, not after the fall. Put a rubber band around the jar at the level of the fresh feed, and you can see exactly what it did while you slept.
Ignore the float test. Dropping a spoonful in water and seeing if it floats tells you there's gas in it. It does not tell you the culture is at peak, and plenty of perfectly good starters sink. If you forget it, almost nothing happens. A starter left a week in the refrigerator will grow a layer of gray liquid on top. That's alcohol, a normal fermentation byproduct. Pour it off or stir it in and feed it twice and it comes back. I've brought mine back from 3 weeks of neglect more than once. These organisms survive the entire history of human baking without anyone understanding them. They will survive your vacation. What they will not survive is the wrong temperature, which is the variable almost every recipe on the internet quietly refuses to give you. Quick thing, then back to it. Your resource. 1-page card with the feeding ratios, the temperature table, and the baker's percentages for a plain loaf. Is in the description, free, no email. Take it or don't, I won't mention it again. Every recipe you've read says something like, first rise 4 to 5 hours. That instruction is worthless without a second number, and the second number is almost never there. Fermentation is a biological rate, and biological rates run on temperature. Dough at 78 degrees Fahrenheit ferments dramatically faster than dough at 68. Same flour, same starter, same everything. Roughly speaking, a 10-degree swing can nearly halve or nearly double how long that first rise takes. So a recipe written by somebody in a warm kitchen in Sacramento will underproof your loaf in a cold kitchen in Missouri in February, and you'll conclude you're bad at this. You aren't. You're working with a missing variable. Buy a probe thermometer and take the temperature of your dough right after you mix it. That number is the one professionals track, and they aim for a target and hit it on purpose by adjusting the temperature of the water they mix with. Cold kitchen, warm water. Warm kitchen, cool water. For most home sourdough, mixing to somewhere between 76 and 78 degrees gives you a first rise you can plan a day around. Then watch the dough, not the clock. It's done rising when it's grown by roughly half again, feels alive and domed rather than slack, and shows bubbles at the edges where it meets the container. Temperature does one more thing, and this is the lever nobody tells you about. Warmer and wetter conditions push that bacterium toward lactic acid, which is the mild, yogurty, round flavor. Cooler and stiffer conditions push it toward acetic acid, which is the sharp vinegar tang. So if your bread is sour, and you don't want it sour, you don't need a different starter. You need a warmer, wetter one. And if you want that hard San Francisco tang, you keep your starter stiffer and cooler, and you let the dough sit cold overnight. That's flavor by dial, not by luck. And it's the single biggest thing separating people who bake sourdough from people who make sourdough on purpose. Now go back to the bag. In 2015, a man named Chris Young, who runs the Real Bread campaign in Britain, coined a word for this: Sourfaux. It means bread sold under the name sourdough that was made with baker's yeast, or chemical raising agents, or additives, or acid dosed in at the end to fake the flavor, or some combination of those. That last one deserves a second. Large bakeries do add acetic acid late in the process to get a tang the process itself never produced. The sour without the dough. His organization has been pushing for what they call an Honest Crust Act since 2009. It would do one simple thing: define sourdough in law as bread leavened only by a live starter culture with no additives. In January of 2023, a group of baking industry trade bodies went to the British government with their own voluntary code of practice instead. That code would allow 3 different uses of the word sourdough and would permit processing aids, additives, and baker's yeast in products still labeled with it. The Real Bread campaign told the government to reject it and called it what it looked like. And the price gap is the whole reason anybody bothers. The campaign has documented Sourfaux products selling for at least twice the price of comparable loaves from the same brand. Same factory, same process. One word. Now the honest part, because this is where this subject goes off the rails and I'm not going to help it. Long fermentation does measurably reduce phytic acid in the dough, and phytic acid binds minerals, so studies indicate mineral availability improves. Long fermentation also reduces certain fermentable carbohydrates, called FODMAPs, and some people with irritable bowel symptoms report tolerating real sourdough better. Research there is ongoing, and the effect is not settled. Wheat sourdough is not safe for anyone with celiac disease. Fermentation does not remove gluten. If that's you, none of this applies, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The Real Bread campaign's own coordinator says people get carried away with the claims. He's right, and he's the one with a reason to exaggerate. A plain loaf, in baker's percentage: flour 100, water 75, starter 20, salt 2. In grams, that's 500 flour, 375 water, 100 ripe starter, 10 salt. Mix it, rest it half an hour before the salt goes in, and then, instead of kneading, fold it over on itself in the bowl 4 or 5 times across the first couple hours. Wet dough develops structure fine with folds. You do not need to knead sourdough, and you never did. Shape it, put it in a bowl lined with a floured towel, and refrigerate it overnight. That cold rest does 2 things. It makes a slack dough firm enough to score cleanly, and it pushes flavor toward the sharp end. Then the oven, as hot as it goes, with a lid on. Bake it in a covered cast iron pot for the first 20 minutes. The lid is not tradition. The dough is releasing steam, and the lid traps it against the loaf. Steam keeps the crust soft and wet for those first minutes, and a crust that stays soft can keep expanding. That expansion has a name. Oven spring is the last burst of rise that happens in the first minutes of baking, when the trapped gas expands and the yeast makes one final push before the heat kills it. Take the lid off for the last 20 or 25 minutes, and the surface dries and browns and sets hard. Score it right before it goes in, one confident cut about ½ an inch deep at a shallow angle. That cut is where you're telling the loaf to open. Skip it, and it tears wherever it wants. Now the money. At 2026 retail, bread flour runs around $5 for a 5-pound bag, which puts 500 grams at roughly $1.10. Salt, 2 cents. Call it $1.15 in the bowl, or closer to $2.50 a loaf once you honestly count the flour you feed the starter every week, whether you bake or not. A bakery loaf near me runs $8. My grandmother Verna never made a loaf of sourdough in her life. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy for me to stand here and hand you a story about a crock passed down. There wasn't one. She made biscuits, and the leavening came out of a can, and she bought that can at the store like everybody else in Carter County. She used the industrial shortcut, the same way her neighbors switched from lard to the can of shortening, and she'd have thought I was soft in the head for spending 2 weeks growing something she could buy for $1. This is the one thing I do that she didn't. And yet she is the only person I've ever known who would have understood the jar immediately. Because what I actually do every morning is feed something on a schedule, look at it, and decide whether it needs more food or a warmer spot, or to be left alone. I adjust for the weather. I read its condition. When I go away, I make arrangements for it. That's not baking. That's animal husbandry, and I'm running it on a countertop with about 1 trillion head. She did that for 50 years with hens. I just do it with something too small to see. Let me give you the arithmetic, and then let me be honest about it, in that order. A bakery loaf a week at $8 is $416 a year. Baked at home, all in, counting the starter you feed whether you bake or not, it's closer to $130. That's a difference of $286 a year. And over 30 years, it's around $8,500.
Now the honest part. That loaf costs you 30 or 40 minutes of hands-on work a week. Over a year, that's about 26 hours. So you are buying that $286 at roughly $11 an hour. And if money is your only reason for standing here, that's a bad wage, and you should go buy the bread. The money was never the cost of not knowing this. The cost is that until about 20 minutes ago, you could not walk into a store and tell the difference between a loaf that took 2 days and a loaf that took 2 hours with vinegar in it. Both said sourdough. One cost twice as much, and there was no law anywhere requiring the label to mean anything at all. So here's the one thing to do tonight, and it costs you nothing you don't already own. Before bed, put 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water in a clean jar. Whole wheat or rye if you have it, plain all-purpose if you don't. Stir it to a thick paste. Set the lid on top without screwing it down and leave it on the counter. Then do nothing for 2 days. Don't feed it, don't stir it, don't look up whether you're doing it right. On the third morning, look at the surface. There will be bubbles in it, and they will have come from your kitchen and your flour, and nowhere else. The next video is salt-rising bread, which is an Appalachian wild ferment that uses a completely different set of organisms, smells like nothing else on earth, and almost nobody makes anymore. If you want to be here when it goes up, subscribe. And tell me 2 things in the comments. How old is your starter, and where did it come from? Somebody's kitchen, a mail-order packet, or flour and water on your own counter? I'm curious how many of these things in circulation actually trace back to somebody's grandmother, and I read every one.